Sorry, you're live.
Okay. Well, okay. Welcome to Studies in Introversion, a reflection on conflict resolution. I'm going to start by just quickly highlighting a couple upcoming events and also emphasize for the folks who are online, there is a little bit of a delay, so we apologize for that. But if you do want to engage and participate by sending us an email, Darcy will be monitoring coreclinic1@gmail.com, so feel free to send them on. They typically come in a little bit after the conversation, but no problem with us being able to interrupt. This is definitely meant to be as interactive as possible. September 27th is our next event, and I just want to highlight it. Particularly, I want people to be thinking about it because this is the one we've talked about a couple times where we're speed geeking. So we are going to have up to 9 speakers from amongst this group and from others who are interested who have one thing they're passionate about related to, in any way, conflict resolution that they want to do a 5-minute talk on to introduce to everybody else. At this point, we're at this great place. We've got 6 out of the 9 speakers booked, but there's still 3 spots. So I would love to have more people step up and say they're interested. We've got topics right now that are ranging from adverse childhood experiences through tax morality and principled settlements. It's going to be really a wide range already, and it can only go wider. So we welcome any kinds of ideas. 5 minutes, and then you have basically a 3-minute question and answer period afterwards, and then we switch speakers. So absolutely encourage anybody who's interested or thinking about it. September 27th, but email me if you want to be part of the presentations. We've also added something following that session now. For those of you who've been following the new mediators group, which is relatively new, and we've had 2 meetings, we're going to have a presentation for the new mediators group following. So at 6:30 to 8:30, Jennifer Crawford, who is one of our board members from Kamloops, is going to come down to join us that day, and she's putting on a presentation on the business of mediation. Now, we will not be live streaming this one because Jen is going to do it as a workshop for the group here, and then she is going to record something afterwards. So there will be something available about a month later, but for that session, you need to be live here, and she will be covering things like how do you actually set up a business as a sole proprietor or in whatever other format that you're going to use, and also looking at intake, agreements to mediate, all of the things that you need to actually go out there as a new mediator. So absolutely welcome everybody to come to that. And let me know if you're going to come, just because if you're not at the early session, you can't get into this building without making arrangements ahead of time. Okay? I'm going to shift over to our Studies in Introversion panel, and I'm going to introduce everybody here and then make the excuses for being on the panel myself as an extrovert. Jacqueline Fehr, I think a lot of you have met because she's our core president, so she's often at a bunch of these events. She's also a lawyer at KPMG Law, which presumably we figured out today, and studying for her LLM. And in that, she is actually doing some really interesting work looking at some interesting applications of dispute resolution in tax. So it'll be quite interesting. Yuki is a mediator, facilitator, and lawyer. She started out in labor law, but these days her practice includes family, employment, working with organizations. She's on all 3 of the rosters with Mediate BC, so she does a really broad range. And Rowan, most of you actually probably know her as my daughter, but she has a much distinct, there are other things that are not about being my daughter.
I have my own life.
Yeah, you have your own life. It's really good. She's also a law student at UCLA, and she's here summering after her 2nd year at DLA Piper. And she's been involved in course since she was in high school, doing a whole pile of stuff, and has a pretty long history with engaging with dispute resolution in one way or another. So of the 3, I'm going to give you their full Myers-Briggs types. One of the ways we're going to talk about introversion tonight is through the Myers-Briggs type indicator definitions. We're also going to talk about some of the newer definitions that Susan Kane is putting out there for quiet. But I'm going to give you the full type so that you can recognize perhaps when there's things that they're not really agreeing about that it may be about something else in their personality as opposed to the introversion. We're expecting lots of common ideas from Jacqueline and Yuki though, because they are both INFPs. So introverted, intuitive feeling perceivers. Rowan is likely to disagree with everything they say as an introverted, sensing, thinking judger.
Which is also a personality type that likes to disagree with everything you say. So.
That's true. And I really was invited to join Jacqueline on the panel when she was first kind of putting things together for two reasons. Because I'm a super out of pattern extrovert. Most of you know me in this kind of environment, so it seems obvious I'm an extrovert. If you meet me in other environments, it is a whole lot less obvious because I am actually, I score more on the introvert side than Jacqueline does on Myers-Briggs, much more, and in a very out of pattern way. So I have some contributions to ways in which that kind of mixed category works. But I think the main reason you invited me is just because I actually am certified in Myers-Briggs Step 2, and so we can talk a little bit about how we do it.
Otherwise, we were all just going to quietly reflect on what we thought introversion was, and no one was going to speak. So we invited Sharon to avoid that.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm an ENTP for the full type. Now, I'm going to pass it to you, Jacqueline. Where do you want to go? Because I feel like I should pass it to you to talk about what introversion is. And I know you know I set up the slides
I know.
with a big focus on what it isn't.
Yes. Well, and I think that, so there's two sources of this definition that we'll talk about today. One is from Susan Cain's book, Quiet, which you may be aware of. It was quite popular. I think it remains quite popular, but it was definitely quite popular a couple years ago. And the other source of the definition is through the Myers-Briggs type indicators. And when we're talking about it, you know, you might find certain things, if you yourself identify as an introvert, you might find that certain things are resonating with you and other things are not. So for example, I'll be completely upfront. I made it about halfway through Susan Cain's book before I lost interest, because that version of introversion doesn't necessarily resonate the same way with me, despite the fact that I did take her test to see if I came out differently on her version of introversion versus the Myers-Briggs definition. I definitely am still solid introvert on her definition, but for some reason it just doesn't resonate as being correct. So we'll talk about some of the reasons why that is, and I'll talk about some of the reasons why that is when we talk about the definitions, but I thought I should start with that bias before I launch into here's how Susan Cain defines introversion.
Well, and whichever version we have, I have to jump in only because I did the slides. So she doesn't know what's coming. But whichever version we have, I think it's important to talk about what it's not.
Yes. So I think going to the first, like what it's not. So this is a really good example, is the Barbra Streisand, Bill Gates example. Bill Gates is an introvert. I mean, that will come as probably no shock to anybody who knows other programmers. But Bill Gates is an introvert, but he's not shy. He's introverted, but he's not shy. Whereas Barbra Streisand, as a comparison, she's an extrovert, but she's very shy. So shyness is not introversion. And these things the assumption is generally made that if you're introverted, you must be shy. And I think that I'm probably a good person to do the presentation on that portion of it, because I am certainly not shy. I am not afraid of public speaking. I am not generally nervous going to events. That word has never been used in relation to me, even as a child. But I'm extremely introverted. And some of that definition comes from the stimulation of these events. So we'll get into that in the next slides. And one of the points to make is that introverts, it's not that we dislike socializing or dislike people. I mean, some introverts probably do, but not all introverts dislike people or dislike socializing. And the other aspect to keep in mind in terms of what it is not is introversion is not social anxiety. So being socially anxious, being anxious in a group, that is also completely different than introversion. Some introverts might be anxious in group settings or in large groups, but that doesn't mean all are. The nice thing about the way that Susan Cain does her definitions is she kind of thinks of it as a quadrant. So if on one axis you have introversion and extroversion, and on the other axis you have, shy, not shy, and then you can have shy introverts, not shy introverts. You can have shy extroverts, not shy extroverts. Same with social anxiety. You can put it on the other axis, and it's the same. So I guess the other thing to mention with her definition, so the Susan Cain definition, I said I would go into why it didn't particularly resonate with me. Her definition.
Tell us what is the definition?
So her definition of introversion is really relating to, I kind of alluded to this, but people who don't particularly like stimulating environments, people who are risk adverse, people who are, who aren't necessarily quick talkers, fast talkers, people who are reflective. I think that pretty much covers it all. Mm-hmm. She also has kind of this ambivert definition she says there's a spectrum, so you can be an ambivert where you fall in the middle of introversion, extroversion, and take from both extroversion and introversion in terms of your characteristics. And then on the other side of the spectrum, she is extroversion, which I don't know the definition of because I definitely did not qualify as that on my exam.
It didn't give a definition. It said look down below at introversion and extroversion.
Oh, okay.
And you probably associate to either or the other or bits and pieces.
There, okay.
That was the helpful definition I got back.
Yeah. On the ambivert. So, but the reason that I didn't find that introversion definition really resonated with me is that it really focused on a lot of risk as being, so if you're introverted, you must have issues with risk. And I would argue that any issue I have with risk is not necessarily my introversion, it's my legal background. I don't think that I became risk adverse as an introvert. I think that was 3 years of law school. So I just didn't feel that was particularly resonant. What I did feel resonated about her definition, at least for me, was around the stimulation, the ability, wanting to be in stimulating environments and what that meant. So to give an example, my husband is equally or more so introverted than I am, much more in-type introvert, and we decided we wanted to go somewhere and read. We like to do that as a couple. We go places and read our books quietly, but this is like a huge weekend outing for us. And we wanted to go to the beach, and we drove to one beach, and we got there, and it was so busy. We actually ended up driving another 45 minutes to find a quieter beach that we could go on where there were fewer people. Not because they were going to talk to us, not because we were going to have to interact with them, but because we didn't want to sit with them, because that would have been too stimulating. The noise, the playing, the sounds, just not having any of it. So we drove 45 minutes out of our way just to avoid sitting with other people. While we read our books and didn't really interact with each other. And that was good. That was like a solid, active day for us. So the stimulation, I think, does resonate with me as, okay, we keep a very quiet house. We have, we don't usually have a lot of people in small spaces. There are times of the day, particularly after work for my husband, in the morning for me, where we just can't with other people. We just can't deal with any sort of conversation or stimulation or anything like that. And so that was more resonant to me than the risk or the quick speaking. I speak incredibly quickly. And again, I don't think that has anything to do with introversion or extroversion for me anyway. I think that's all I have to say on the Susan Cain definition.
All right. Well, I have that one little slide that shows the extroversion, ambiversion, introversion as just the way it's set up. So, we'll go from there to talk just a little bit about Myers-Briggs. And then once we're through the kind of definitional stuff, we'll do a little bit of exercise there before we force Yuki and Rowan to engage. They both know they're going to be called up. I know. Both of you are welcome to join in with comments at any point. I hope you know that. Yes. Okay. I know you both have comments to make. I've also promised that I will create space at the end where there are specific things to invite them to talk about. Okay, so how many of you have done just the basic Myers-Briggs? Because that's usually pretty common, and yeah, so most people. Has anybody done the step 2? Because that's what we're looking at. So just my family.
I've also done it.
And Jacqueline.
I've done it too. Yeah.
Basically, my family have all done Myers-Briggs. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is because I was somebody who had challenges when I did mine in feeling like I really fit the definitions of introversion and extroversion because I resonated with a lot that they talked about in introversion. And it actually helped me a lot when I did the step 2 and realized that, there's a whole bunch of different ways that introversion and extroversion are expressed. This is true for all of the Myers-Briggs categories, but I'm just going to show you these today. But the way they've set it up is they break each dichotomy, so extroversion, introversion, into 5 facets. And this is one of those, they have so much data collected over the years, and they've gone through and run the data to identify what different facets of personality might actually correlate most closely to each of the definitions. So in each of them, they've got 5 facets. From the top down, initiating, receiving, because it's listed first, it means that it is the one that most closely relates to being an introvert or an extrovert. So it would be unusual to score as an introvert in the initiating category. That would be very out of pattern. But you can be out of pattern for anything. They say out of preference. The language they used to use was oops, out of pattern. Apparently that's not really cool anymore. I'm not supposed to use that anymore, but it was really catchy. I don't know, it was very easy to remember. But in any event, as you move down, there's more and more likelihood that as an introvert, for instance, you might be enthusiastic, you might be active. So those are different facets of the behavior that when you see it and you have one of those moments and you felt kind of mixed on it, for me it felt like a big aha, and suddenly it started resonating because I happened to come out as a receiving, intimate, reflective, quiet extrovert. Which, and all of a sudden it was like, yeah, because the original definition of extroversion in Myers-Briggs is not the same as Susan Cain's. It's not about stimulation. It's about where you get energy from and where you direct your energy to. So extroversion is about gaining energy from being in groups and working with people and wanting to put your energy out. So it tends to connect to a bunch of different things that are related to change and different types of speech patterns. You get a whole pile of different things connected to extroversion that all resonated for me. But it made way more sense when I started looking at these. And we'll look at a few of them. So I'm flipping through a couple just to give you ideas, and then we'll talk in more detail about what they are. So this is an out-of-pattern extrovert one. This isn't mine, but this is another out-of-pattern extrovert. And you can see, like, really extreme on one of the introversion scales. This person would be called an intimate reflective extrovert. So they probably would relate to a lot of things that we're talking about from introversion, would probably have some insights into ways that, but because they're on the other side, there'll be a lot of differences. And here's what a couple of out-of-pattern introverts look like. A really, really expressive introvert.
That's like me.
Yeah. That isn't actually yours, but it could be.
But it could be.
But it could be. So somebody who, really is quite self-revealing, talks, willing to share, but otherwise is on the introversion scale. The lower one is even more unusual because that's that initiating out of patterns. So actually the sociable, going out, introducing, hello, hi, my name is. It's what we always thought it was, like the Darcy factor, who would run out onto playgrounds and go, hi, my name is Darcy, who wants to play? And it's that kind of initiating conversation thing.
That's me. I'm a special and unique. I think it's me.
That is actually yours.
Yeah. Special and unique snowflake.
Yeah.
World. But I was never like, oh, hi, I'm Jacqueline, let's play. I was more like, hi, I'm Jacqueline, but this is so-and-so, and this is so-and-so, and you should meet.
Yeah.
And play with each other. And then I will just
absolutely. Yeah. Yes, whereas Rowan would sit back to be introduced by Darcy, but then would share thoroughly in that sort of...
The entire life story would be revealed.
Nothing was private. We learned very quickly, nothing was private.
And then I wasn't allowed to know things.
It's true.
It's so true.
This is the sad thing when I have too many family members. Anyway, so this is the general definitions of extroversion and introversion, as it says. How do you direct and receive energy? And you'll see everybody here pretty much has done it, so you're familiar with it, so I won't spend time on it. But some of the things that we tend to focus on for conflict resolution are things like that tending to speak first kind of thing. For an extrovert, as opposed to reflective time and thinking before acting for the introvert, and trying to talk things through rather than thinking things through and then talking. Those are the ones that usually come up when we talk about how we run into different kinds of problems. So, these are the definitions of the facets, and I'm giving you just a quick overview of them. But we're going to go into more detail just so you recognize there's initiating, receiving. That's about making contact. And it's exactly what it kind of sounds like, is the degree to which you initiate conversations. It's pretty common to be mixed on some of these, and unlike the way the rest of the Myers-Briggs treats everything as a dichotomy where you are one or the other, no matter how close you are to the edge, when it comes to the facets, the idea is there is a spectrum of behaviors and ways that people express these. And initiating, receiving, pretty common to be mixed. It may be different social circumstances I'm initiating, other circumstances I'm receiving. So you think about your own style, and you can probably place yourself just notionally somewhere on that scale. I'm more receiving, I'm more initiating, or you know what, it totally depends on circumstance, and I'm mixed. Expressive, that's the sharing. That's how open you are about what it is, that's personal, what you talk about, all of those kinds of things. I think a great example was my mother and sister went to a yoga class one time together. My mother is extremely contained, my sister is extremely expressive. They sat down, my sister told this huge story about all of her health history for everything when they did this introduction about why we were doing yoga. And my mother said, I thought it would be good. And my sister looked here going, not much of a sharer, are you? I was going, that was more than I wanted to share. There's just a different amount that you put out there in different environments. And again, mixed often means, well, if I have a good personal relationship, I might share more. But these are your tendencies. The gregarious and intimate. Gregarious gets at that thing of extroversion where I met somebody in the grocery line and I went home to tell everybody about my new friend and what my new friend has to say. That's the gregarious. The intimate is, okay, they're an acquaintance, and so is almost everybody else you have on your friend list. Let me be clear, those are not actually friends. The people I have true connections with are, so it's a different understanding of what level of intimacy needs to be reached for different types of sharing and different types of engagement. Active, reflective, that one often comes into play in classrooms a lot because you get the really active learners. And nowadays, we were having a conversation before most people got here about just how there's a real presumption nowadays that we're all active learners. And that everybody wants to be in groups and you want to be discussing and that these are the ways that we'll learn. Well, that's because there are more extroverts than introverts in society, and there is a social bias towards extroversion and a belief that those are things, skills and behaviors that should be learned, and if somebody doesn't have them, then this is good for them. As opposed to those people who are extroverted should actually learn how to sit down and spend some reflective time quietly. So it's a bit of a pendulum shift as to how this is happening in education, but you see it in lots of other circumstances too. You're probably at conferences where there's a push to put everybody together. There's businesses where there's the let's put everybody in really giant pods so they can interact.
Sorry.
Can't
imagine.
Guess we know where you sit. Yeah. And then the enthusiastic and quiet, that tends to be about the read other people get of you too, because it's about how obvious people's energy is to others, how comfortable they are with the busy and calm environment. So extroversion is often seen because it's about this, like, I'm super engaged. That can be just part of the enthusiasm. I mean, sometimes it's the sharing, sometimes it's the initiating, but sometimes it's just you can see the energy being gained by being around and enthusiasm building. And I think, Yuki, that this is one of the places you're a little bit
That's the only place. Like, initiating, receiving, I'm in the mid-zone, so I'm right in the middle. But yeah, enthusiastic, I'm a little bit more on the enthusiastic side as opposed to quiet. So I am actually, like, sincerely, internally enthusiastic. And I think people might sense that, and I know that. But I wouldn't say I'm lively enthusiastic and seek the spotlight. Like, I don't think I'd go that far.
No, and I mean, there's obviously that range from, you know, just actually being quite enthusiastic and engaged to, oh no, I want everybody to be noticing what I'm doing.
And presumably it changes too, like depending on what's going on. Because
Sure.
I'd say, like, I'm not strongly quiet on the introversion scale, but there are days where just this feeling of other people near me makes me want to scream.
Yes.
It's like I don't know if other people have ever had nerve pain, but that's the quality, like fingers on the chalkboard. Like, you don't have to talk to me, but just even being near me, like, and there are some times where that's just too much. And you know, it's not the same every day. It's not that that's the same feeling I have all the time, but it's kind of yeah.
Is it a build?
A build, I guess. It can be a build, or it can be like if something's going on, like maybe this is kind of leaping ahead to talking a bit about mediation and things like that, but I think in very stressful environments. So if I'm very stressed about something, say something's going on, like at work, big project, or we've got some litigation going on and I'm doing a lot of work or I'm prepping and I'm just feeling overwhelmed with that, then I think I'm closer to needing to be on the quiet side. Whereas if I'm feeling calm, if I'm centered, if it's been kind of a quieter couple weeks at work, and then I'm maybe a little bit more on the enthusiastic side, or at least the, like, please don't talk to me, it feels like I'm having a root canal. Like it. So, you know, there's that. So I think there's a bit of a build, but there's also, I think, high intensity situations where it also kind of comes out.
Right. And then they have that is, we tend to go towards your preference when you're stressed. Is that correct?
For sure. There is, and that makes sense too.
Yeah.
There's kind of two aspects to it. You are more likely, because preference, I'm not really emphasizing all of the ways that preference is understood simply because most people have done something with this before, and we're just focusing on this. But generally speaking, I mean, preference is not about ability. It doesn't connect to any of that. Having a preference for introversion doesn't mean you can't behave in an extroverted fashion, you can't take on any of these kinds of things. It's about it taking more energy to do that. But you can do all of those kinds of things. But in stress, most people will tend to dig deep into whatever their preferences are. And because that's the most natural way to be. So it's likely to be more introverted when they're stressed. And so that, which makes total sense of what you're saying, Jacqueline, it fits into that. There's some other things that I don't want to go into today where they call it in the grip, when you've actually gone beyond into a state of extreme stress. And then there are some patterns to problematic ways in which things get expressed that are actually somewhat self-destructive after you've gone past the point where you're simply becoming more introverted because there's a stress around you, or you're becoming, more focused on the feeling and everything needs to be about the value of people than it does this. There's those kinds of stresses.
That sounds very interesting.
It is very interesting, but it's definitely a different topic.
I like how it's like in the grip.
I know, I was like, mental note.
Okay, my intention was not to introduce another topic, just answering. Okay, so we thought it would be kind of amusing. All right. Now, other people agreed with me. This is not just me. But do people have paper? Because that was why I was asking for paper.
There's pens here.
We've got lots of extra pens, but yeah, you can write on the back of those. I've got extra pens here if people want them. This is not instantaneous. The first thing is not going to be writing. But it's just easier if I give them out now. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I can't open this. Anybody else need pens? Okay. All right? All right, looks good. All right. So we thought that it might be interesting to just kind of look at a couple of these. I don't have a flip chart, which I was kind of hoping I would, but that's okay. We're just going to pretend that you can all see what I'm writing, as Rowan's writing, because Rowan's ready to take notes.
Always.
Always. Always ready. But what we thought we would do is try a couple different ways of getting at things. So probably it's not a big giveaway to say brainstorming is pretty universally recognized as an extroverted way to get ideas out. So we're going to make you do the brainstorm first about looking at initiating and receiving and brainstorming how that particular facet of extroversion, introversion impacts negotiation approaches. So we want you to not be writing at this point. This is throw things out. Rapid fire. Hit Rowan as quickly as you
Don't even
can.
put up your hand, just yell at me.
You want to in
Yeah.
answer to those questions?
Well, it's not those questions. It's initiating, receiving. The questions give you a sense of what it means to remind you of what initiating and receiving are. Because these are the things that happen. At a social event, how comfortable you're introducing yourself to others. Yes, no, those are definitional for initiating, receiving.
So what do you want thrown out?
What I want thrown out is, Darcy's going to start.
I have a thought. When you have a neutral person, who's supposed to be this neutral party, but you know that maybe one party is more comfortable introducing themselves to this new neutral party first, then maybe that person can sometimes appear to be kind of getting in there first or whatever else.
Okay.
So that appearance can be weird.
I like how you read them like a proper web.
Yes, but I also am not fully.
I know, I was
Like,
like, I
what
can't,
she's
like,
saying.
Sorry, what you're saying is there could be an advantage in a negotiation setting to the person who's an initiator because they get in first and build relationship.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Instantaneous.
She's right. She's like that's what we're looking for is what are the differences that might come out of being initiating or receiving in a negotiation.
Also the socializing around the breaks.
Oh, that's a good one.
Do you want to say more?
Whether the socializing around the breaks, like, so somebody might need to actually like take time and be away from all the people, but then they're all talking
Mm-hmm.
and building relationship, and you're outside of that relationship building.
Okay.
But those people that are receiving, they're really paying attention. So they're taking in all the little details that other people don't always, that the extroverts or the initiating people don't catch.
Potentially, sure.
So it seems to me you need to, apropos of that, when you're engaged in a negotiation, you want a team You want somebody who's going to be the extrovert, if you will, and somebody who's going to be the introvert. So you've got somebody that's making note, while somebody else is prompting the behavior on the other side.
Okay. We're not brainstorming how to make it better. We're brainstorming what are the impacts? No, it's fine. It's just
Even like closeness at the table, right? Like how much
Yeah.
space each person has
Oh yeah.
when they're sitting.
Where they sit.
That's true.
And how comfortable they are with that closeness and what other people might interpret wanting distance as.
The shape of the table to the same, and in rectangular you can be opposite them and have that safe table in between, whereas circular is a little
Like
slippery, you might
some
fall around
tables
the
are too
edge.
skinny and their feet are too close to me.
That's true. Yes.
And is table automatic, or is there a
As somebody that is quite introverted, I like tables.
Because they have a
Especially if there's
required
nobody
amount of
on the other
space.
side.
Especially if they're thick.
Yeah, because it automatically means, because I have a friend who knows that they have to move their chair back if they're going to talk to me. That they actually, and they told me they deliberately do this. They're like, I actually think I need to add 2 or 3 feet if I'm talking to you from what I would automatically do with other people. Which, yeah.
okay?
A good friend.
And I mean, this is actually, this is good. If you're good, I'm going to stop just because we're blending two things here. We're blending introversion, extroversion, rather than just focused on the receiving, initiating, which is fine. We started with initiating, receiving. One of the things that happens with brainstorming anyway is exactly what happened here. We start adding other things and not staying necessarily focused on task, because it's easy. It gives you a good idea. It's like, whoa, let's go there, which is exactly what's happening. I was just going to comment and welcome comments from you guys on brainstorming. There's actually a fellow, his name is Dario Nardi, and he's a psychologist who does a lot of study on different facets of the Myers-Briggs. He goes into quite a lot of detailed work on it. And one of the things he writes about, he has actually quite a big long post about brainstorming for introverts and all of the different ways that you might adapt the approach. Because we do tend to just say rapid fire, throw things out, don't think about them, don't analyze them, don't critique them. Those are kind of counterintuitive for most introverts. It's like, I don't want to throw stupid ideas out there. But, you know.
Such a waste of time. Why would you put out all the wrong answers? Can they just say the right answer and go from there?
So, well, some of his things are things like imposing a moment of silence for everyone to reflect, right? And write down your thoughts and then share some thoughts. Pausing periodically, just saying, okay, we're going to just stop for a moment and think. And leaving space on the whiteboard, if you're capturing things on the whiteboard, because there might be epiphanies that come later. They don't have to be then. It might be walking away from it. And he always suggests a really strongly facilitated follow-up so that it's not just kind of left there on the board, that there's a chance to actually do something and facilitate a discussion around it, that those are all things that might make brainstorming as a technique better. And I know that the two things that I've used in other settings are brain writing. Has anybody done brain writing? Which is, we were thinking of doing something sort of related to brain writing as a next step to experience the introvert version, but it'll be similar. But brain writing in its full form is you have your note paper and you have to come up with 3 ideas and then pass your paper. And now, and you receive another paper. And now you have to add 3 ideas to the 3 ideas that are on there.
Yeah.
And you just keep the passing going. Sounds like somebody here's done it.
Oh yeah, I tried that, or I participated in a group exercise where it was in a group. Yeah, yeah, that seemed to work quite well.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
a good
you,
idea.
you definitely see different ones.
Yeah, and then you kind of go over them, all of them at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very surprising for most people that if you split a group, a large group, into a brainstorming group and a brain writing group, the brain writing group always has way more ideas. Way more. It's I've seen double in classes when I've gone for like just a 10-minute stretch. it's astonishing how rapidly those different ideas get added, because you see those ideas, you have time to think about and you respond to them. So it's actually quite an interesting exercise.
And there isn't that public part of it.
Mhm.
That's what I find.
It's true that it's easier not to censor yourself because you're
Yeah.
writing it down rather than having to talk to somebody.
Yep, there you go. Larger groups think about brainwriting. Structured rounds is the other one that gets used a lot for bringing ideas out of groups, because it can work for extroverts or introverts. This is not just an introverted form of doing it, but where that's one of those where it's passed around in a circle. So it reflects some of the circle practices that we do, where you've got the talking stick and it's your turn and everybody else is paused. But it's a brainstorming thing where you circle. You can pass if you don't have something you want to put on the board, but if you do, you can give several ideas all at once. And nobody else can talk about it, nobody else can talk about your ideas. And you've got lots of time in preparation as it comes around the circle. Does that make sense? I mean, you understand what I'm saying. It's like you're sitting in the circle, and it's really quite similar to a circle process. And again, it has a tendency, when I've used it, I've often used it as a competitive, like, not competitive, that's the wrong word, but I like to do comparative. Just competitive comes out in my head. But a comparative where two groups are doing it, and again, most of the time, the structured rounds group has more ideas than the brainstorming group. And the brainstorming group usually has lots of things written down that are all about the same thing, because they all got onto one path and stayed there. Yeah. Easier to be thinking ahead in structured rounds and change your ideas. Now, do we want to try one quiet writing one? I feel we should.
Okay.
Yeah, you good with that? I was gonna say, Rowan has a little bit she could share. Anybody else need paper?
I'm good.
Oh,
Lana too?
Thank you.
So we didn't have a good chance to talk about this amongst the four of us, but in my head, I was thinking that we would let people choose whichever of the other facets made the most sense to them or resonated the most with them about something for dispute resolution, and do the same exercise. But we could also just say introversion, extroversion, and let you continue with what was already happening, which was all of them. You don't have to try and keep it in your head which one you're talking about.
Are you putting it out?
I'm putting it out.
Everyone?
This is a request. It's mostly you guys at least. Come on, panelists, what do you want?
Show us that page with all of the facets. And
Yeah,
the-
that's what I'm going back to that if I can. I seem to be having
Yeah.
good
Yeah,
work.
that's
Okay.
right.
So I can leave that up anyway, and
Yeah.
I actually don't feel like it matters which way you do it. The idea is to just engage in the exercise and get a sense of what it's like. So we're going to give you 3 minutes of quiet writing time to do your own brainstorming, and then we'll let you discuss with another person for 2 minutes after that.
And you,
Again, you can either pick expressive contained, for instance, and say, how does that impact on negotiation or mediation? Or if you do a global introversion, extroversion, because that's easier, I don't see any real problem with that. But I will start a timer. So you have 3 minutes.
So, can I just ask a question here?
Absolutely.
So, what exactly you're asking us for ideas on how, I just wanna make sure I've understood, so how,
Where you sit on this might impact your own participation, or if you're a mediator, for instance, you might think about it from the perspective of, I would change a process this way.
oh, I see, in
You
order
can
to
think-
deal
yeah.
with these players, so to speak.
Yeah, or these
If-
possible things that could be
Okay.
happening in the room.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And the online audience is encouraged to be writing too for 3 minutes. They'll have less ability to do the 2-minute interaction.
All right. So now you're going to pick one other person, and you have 2 minutes to discuss what you've thought about, and see if you can come up with more ideas.
Okay.
All right. Fire away.
I did think
We're so good. I never meet them.
Yeah, I know, that's true. That's
Right.
one of the errors.
It is very interesting trying to make a group of three.
Yeah, come and join us, please.
You know what?
We are
Sharon
speaking over this very
Yeah. That's how I got it. I got this down too, but there was one other item.
So Taryn focused a lot
Well, I did mine in
on how people could come across. So introverts might come across as being more introverted or thinking about things more, whereas expressive people are often seen as friendly and that can sometimes be a bit of a.
And what do you do? Do you do something with this?
No,
Do you balance these two in some way, or?
Any plans of action? Not really, sorry. I did find that the people who are more reflective and want to think through things, I was curious about in mediation practice. I don't think there's often, they're often not given enough time to have that reflective period before come to a conclusion, say something, respond to whatever has been told.
So, like what initiators will tend to open the discussion, and the others will tend to listen, and then structure time to listen, and then to reflect back on what was said. One of the things that I like to do is start a conversation where whoever's talking is listened to, which is said, and then the other person is encouraged not to think, not to make mental comments.
I was just looking like our list.
Regardless of, and that kind of eliminates or blends these two things together. It makes it disappear. If I listen to you and I'm thinking about what you say,
Once I do it this
then
way,
I'm adding,
it gets stuck.
not as a
Now, each
criticism,
one
not
has to be the
as
same
a,
number of
yes,
moments.
Oh, yes.
I am different in some ways. So you might have
Sorry, I just.
1, 2, 5, 6
Well, no,
as a
I do
subject,
that.
and I might know 7 and 8. If I can add that energy to what you
And I
say,
kind of
this is a native from the north. Actually, we are talking circles, not the stick.
Okay, folks, we're gonna come back to the big group. I'm super conscious that our online audience cannot do too much of this this particular interaction. I hope that they spent time doing extra quiet reflective time. That was the plan.
Okay, so I'm just wondering for everybody, any reflections on how that process was for you? The process of the brain writing and then having a discussion with your friend or colleague.
We found, I mean, you tell me if you agree, but I think we found it interesting that we had both focused on similar facets, came up with different examples or different fact situations in which they would matter, and the expression of the different ways in which they would matter or could be implemented, I think helped both of us in thinking about our own situations.
Yeah, because I was doing expressive and contained, and I want to jump in, and I'm having a problem right now with one particular person that doesn't like that and is just going backward. So this forced me to do the contained, which then the answers seem to flow. The right responses seem to flow a lot more. Which I should have done this in my situation.
Oh, great.
Forcing yourself into taking on the role of the person who isn't you may give you better clues as to how maybe you can deal with it.
And these guys are definitely going to be okay for being picked up by Mike. Not everybody behind will be if you're contributing. So I might need to ask people to step forward a little bit, just in line with the camera.
Okay, so do they have to be in front of the camera or just in line?
Just in line, it'll get picked up. These guys are in line, so they're probably fine. Yeah.
Okay. So anyone
Wow.
else want to share?
I can share.
Yeah, do you want to come up?
Thanks. Thanks,
Um,
Nancy.
What I found really interesting is that we have very different interpretations of your question, and then fundamentally different answers in different places that we had gone. And if we'd had more time to talk, we could have gotten to somewhere much more interesting than we would have in a brainstorm.
Interesting.
Okay.
Because you had the chance
Because we
to
had
start.
fundamentally different, because whoever starts in a brainstorm defines the interpretation of the question.
Yep.
Mhm.
Right.
It's a good observation.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to come up and discuss? There's some mutterings over there.
Yeah, the groups that are talking to each other could possibly come up and talk to us.
Okay. Yeah, come on up.
Come on up, Suzanne. No, you need to just
Yeah,
stand.
yeah, and then come up in front.
You're really in the back corner.
Yeah.
So, this is on what we got. So, I looked at expressive contained, and Ginny looked at extroversion, introversion, and it's funny because we came up with much the same, but expressed it differently. Extroversion, initiate conversation, so control direction and content to a degree, and I said, tell their story, make their points. And then on introversion, thinks through before responding and so may have an advantage. And I said, may find it difficult to discuss what they need to, but play cards close to chest. And then we had likely to initiate an offer to settle for extroversion, which can influence the outcome. And will likely think they have been more successful on extroversion. And then on introversion, might know that they have been more successful. And I liked Ginny's Ginny's comment at the end, which was that extroversion like a dog, introversion like a cat.
Wow.
Interesting.
Great. Thank you.
Now, we can go on to some of the questions we were going to ask and discuss, and invite people to, as they want to, engage with us on these questions. But if you do, I will ask you to step up unless you're in the front row, unfortunately. Okay?
But that doesn't mean you're on camera, right? It just means
No,
that your
no.
voice is.
No, but I will tell you to step back if you're doing a weird thing. Darcy should be signaling people if they are standing, doing the, I'm standing right there and it is just shot from here. She's learned, she's supposed to tell me when I do that, so she'll tell others too.
Yeah,
It's true.
I'll warn you.
Yeah. So I had asked everybody here to think a little bit and talk a little bit about how introversion's affected the way that they've approached work as a starting point, whether that was law school, legal practice, mediation, but all of those things that are kind of connected, conflict resolution things. So do you want to, who wants to start?
I can start.
Whoa.
I guess I have a few different examples, and maybe I'll just give like one and we can all sort of go through. But because I've been in law school for the last couple of years, and in particular in law school in the US, which is a culture that is much more centered around extroversion, I have felt that my introversion is very noticeable. And one of the times that I really noticed it actually was my first ever property law class in the first week of school. It was something similar to what we were doing actually, what we've just been doing, where we were put into a group and given a fact pattern and told, all right, come up with all of the different property claims that could exist here. And of course none of us had any idea what any property claims were. And so it was kind of just, we were supposed to just throw things out there in our groups. And I was with someone, a couple of people, but in particular one person who is very, very extroverted and likes to think out loud, and whereas I am very, very introverted and like to think on my own and then I'll share my thoughts. And we both really recognized that about ourselves and about one another, and so she spent most of the time doing most of the talking, and it helped her to just have me to sort of nod along, whereas I was then thinking through all of the implications of what she was saying and all of the things that I could think of, but wasn't actually sharing them back. And so from the outside, it looked like our group wasn't having a back and forth at all, and there was nothing going on, but it was actually a super meaningful way for, especially both of us, but for everyone in the group to sort of go with their own processes of learning. Or should I continue to give examples? I can do that.
You can give more.
I've got a couple.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, do you want me to go? Okay. So I'll start with one from law school then as well. When I first started law school, I am an initiating introvert, which means that I'm not afraid to make social contact.
Okay,
But
that's a judgy way. Receivers are not afraid to make social contact as a receiver.
That's right.
Not
Okay.
afraid.
So but I just want to make sure. See, I think that comes from a place where it's assumed that if you're an introvert, you're shy. So it's a fear rather than a receiving, initiating. So that was a good learning moment. So it wasn't that I was nervous about making, and it's not that I'm even a receiver, but it was still very difficult. You go to these, I went to law school in Canada, so I don't have the American experience, but you go to, for example, these wine and cheeses, and you would have, it's an extremely stimulating room. You have maybe 20, 30 employers setting up booths. There's no walls, so the noise level is very, very high. It's not like you're in somewhere where they've got those sound absorbers, so there's a lot of echo, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of people wandering, so there's no order to how people are wandering the room. And I had to learn how to do those events, because if I was in type preference, despite the fact that I can initiate, that just made me want to shut down. And so I remember in my first year of law school making the deliberate decision to go to those events and basically learn how to approach them. And it's completely learned, but I would watch other people that I knew were more extroverted than I was and kind of like join with them and then like observe how they would interact with other people, and then I would mimic said behavior to learn how to do these events. And I did this and I 100%, I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to learn how to do this. This was not like by accident. No, I deliberately decided to learn how to do this. And to this day, I use a lot of the tricks that I observed in those moments. But it was definitely not an in-type preference kind of meeting for me. But it's what's expected of you if you want, at least in the Canadian environment, if you're looking for summers or articles, you go to those events, you make the connections. That's supposed to be potentially your first intimate connection with these people in this massively horrible environment that, I'm not choosing at least. So yeah, that was extremely difficult for me, but I still don't know if I did it well, but I am currently employed, so I assume that I couldn't have been that and to be fair, actually, the current employment could not come from meeting Mark at one of those events, but I can't imagine I did that horribly.
No, I'm going to say you did the other thing. You did the making friends with people who might make recommendations so you could get the personal connection.
Yes, that also. So in the end, I did in fact get the job where I'm extremely happy through a personal connection. So my introversion, in fact, was the thing that helped with that. But I still had to learn how to navigate those extroverted events because that was what was expected of you.
We had a question. David, do you mind just stepping up in line with the camera? You don't have to be on screen. You just need to be beside it. Thanks.
I'm interested in whether your environment that you were in this period of time of your training, have you become less introverted?
No. So I wondered about that because I had taken the test.
I thought you've got more courage.
but it's not really about courage though, because it wasn't shyness and it wasn't fear, like as when I misspoke in the beginning, Sharon was able to point out. So it wasn't a fear or it wasn't a shyness. It was just that's just not how I connect with people.
Okay.
It's just not how my relationships are built. That's just not how I had deep connections with people that were worthwhile pursuing. And especially in those kinds of environments where you're so stimulated that you just can't really focus your conversation and focus on that interaction between individuals just was so out of preference for me.
Yeah. And it's stressful too.
It's, because it's...
Is it set up like that to test you?
I don't think so. I think it's just set up that way because, well, I mean, Mark says it's cheaper, but
Tradition.
I think it's traditionally done that way. I think you probably would find a lot of extroverts in that environment potentially.
I would say that most of the firms will send extroverts, and most people who are involved in the careers department are extroverts, because that's something that you're attracted to, that kind of work.
Totally.
So there's no thinking about, is this actually the best way to do it? And it's cheaper.
Yeah.
But having said that, if I'm making connections to students now, I do it through like one-on-one mentoring.
Okay.
So maybe there's a bias to the way that I'm interacting with people now, because again, now that I'm in the position where I'm on, I guess, the other side of the table from being the student, how I would choose to make those connections, how I would choose to make those relationships is through that one-on-one mentoring. It wouldn't be going to an event like that if I could avoid it.
The environment sounds very much like waterfront and dealing with longshoremen,
Yes.
which I did for many years.
It has its commonalities.
Sharon, these personality types don't really change, do they? Like,
The theory of the Myers-Briggs theory is that you do not change over time. You can test differently based on the circumstances that you're in, and it's not uncommon. Like a really common one is somebody who's injured and is normally an intuitive will often test as a sensor, because their focus is on rehab of an injury or something like that. So there's a greater focus on that aspect. It's like the physical becomes more important. A lot of judgers, if a spouse dies, it's really common to test as a perceiver over a period of time, and they'll say, yeah, that's exactly how I'm behaving right now. I have to just let everything go. I can't control it. I can't, as long as I'm focused on the control, I just can't function. So there are times where you will test differently, but most people will say, no, if you've actually self-identified as this is the right fit, you should stay within the upper boxes. You definitely can shift on these facets though. And I mean, I've shifted dramatically on facets depending on honestly on mood when I take the test, but I don't flip out of the extrovert box. Yeah.
Just to share an example of how your circumstances when you test. So the first time I took the Myers-Briggs was, I think, the first year of working as a lawyer. And so I was actually, as part of the career counseling, because I was looking for options, and I was a J, right? And even now, like, I'm a P, but I'm not like an extreme P. Like, I'm kind of,
you're mixed.
So I'm mixed. So it's but it did reflect, I think, the time where that was very important. The judging qualities were very important. Yeah.
And I thought that mine would shift because you don't meet a lot of INFPs who do tax, in particular, but law also. I think it's a fairly rare. I thought I would shift just based on, you'd think I'd be more used to dealing with people who are not like me and I'd absorb some of those tendencies. But every time I test, I come out INFP.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah. All of these things are like pointers or little awarenesses. So when you're dealing with any of these things, and if you're in the middle of an initiator and a receiver, or the job of the mediator is to be aware and balance out the situation, and to really focus, I think, on service, what is needed. So I may be like this or I may be like that, but if the situation calls for me to bring this kind of awareness to the situation, by definition, I think it behooves us to do that rather than, to be aware of where we're at. But we're called to do a service, which is to make things clear, make things accessible. And that, it's not necessarily by being one or the other.
No, I think I've said before in many of these, one of the reasons I find it useful is not because I'm going to meet somebody and then try and assess them. It's because that is not what you're doing. You're not going, oh, in my little passing moment of doing my pre-mediation meeting, I've figured out that they have these things. That's just ridiculous and not something that is going to be true at all. But I know myself, and I know where my preferences are, and I know that I have tendencies to do something rather than something else. So it's really helpful for me to know I'm really extreme at something.
Yeah.
I'm not going to think about these other things when I'm in conflict. So I can more helpfully think of what else can you do. One of the reasons we're doing this on introversion is because introverts are often not heard to be speaking for themselves about what it is that is happening for them in these different settings. And we've heard a few times people kind of fall into this. I mean, even Jacqueline with this perception.
Such a teaching moment.
That it's like it's like about, I know it is. Well, it's just so funny because you were the one who was especially about it. Is the most annoying thing is for people to perceive you as being shy, right? Or to perceive it as being about these other things, or you're afraid of something, or whatever, or you're submissive. Like that's another one that comes with it.
Submissive is the most. Yeah.
Like, and there's very little that is more irritating than those perceptions. So I just it's about giving a chance to hear about what that looks like from the other side.
Well, and I think well, for me, maybe, and I'm not sure, this sounds a little INFP when I'm just about to say it, so I'm gonna start with that awareness. But I think it's made me more compassionate and empathetic towards other people to understand where I'm coming from and understand what is on the other side of that. So instead of somebody doing something because they don't care or because they're trying to aggravate you or because, you think about introverts in particular. You think about Rowan's story where somebody's speaking to her and she's not responding, but it's not that she's not engaging. It's not that she isn't thinking about what's being said. It's not that she's doesn't have anything to say. It's that's how she interacts with the situation. And I think understanding where you are and then where the other side might be from your type helps you get that, I call it compassion. There's probably a better, less INFP word for it, but it gives you that opportunity to really understand and create a space where, that judgment of people maybe isn't there. And I think in the mediation, that's important because maybe if somebody looks like they're not participating, it might seem like they don't want to participate or they aren't engaged with participating, when in fact they are. And they are actively participating for them. And I think that's kind of maybe one of the important takeaways too, of understanding where you lie.
I'll give you the flip side of that's an F kind of way of describing it.
Yeah.
The T way of describing it would be, it's really logical to take into account how other people might actually be experiencing things. Because if you ignore that aspect, things are just going to blow up. So you might as well pay attention to it.
Yeah, exactly.
I had when we were doing our handwritten stuff, I'd made a note wondering about the role of the mediator in respect of the active versus reflective, and trying to picture a situation where you have a more active party on one side and a more reflective party on the other. And the notes I made to myself were, well, for the more reflective party, if you as the mediator organize or call for a caucus or some time to back off and think, then that might be great. But the flip side of that is the active party is frustrated and feels like they're losing momentum in the discussion. So you can see whichever way you go, it's a challenge of trying to find a way to balance that, I suppose.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, when I was thinking about impact on mediation, like some of the ways in which you can adapt are structural, and I think that's one way is the breaks to accommodate the reflective and also my own reflective needs. But you're right, Mark. I mean, it is such a balancing act when you do call breaks, and the frustration, and sometimes you have to really keep going back to that party and say, yeah, it's progressing, and thanks for your patience, and hey, how are you doing? And also shorter sessions. So
I was
all day.
That's one of the things I have on time spent, length of day.
Length of day.
That's number 2 on my list. Like, no.
Because I mean, by the end of the day, like, I don't know about. I mean, I'd be interested to hear from everybody else, but it's exhausting. Like, you're in this room with these people for
and number 3 on my list after time of day is agreeing to something just to end the session. So like, you're not getting, there's no actual agreement. You haven't gone to a mediation or negotiation effectively. You're just agreeing so you can leave the room. At this point, it just hurts so much to be in the room. You're just agreeing so that you can go. And so then you have that, like, okay, like after a day when you've just agreed so that you can leave and get a break from this, are you going to have that buyer's remorse? Do you have people who are not happy with the way that the mediation went because they just had to agree to get out of that room?
Yeah.
And so, if you think about these all day long mediations, like,
Yeah, and I think it's really important to address that if you find yourself in, because I mean, you're not going to get an all-day mediation unless somebody wants it, right? Like they want to do it, So that so there's that. So so it is the party's wishes, but being careful of that, agreeing so that we can all go home kind of phenomenon is really important. So I tend to do like. Even like the small claims those were short, those that we used to do. And then even for families, like a first session, I really prefer to do a short, like a 2 or 3 hour, like a half-day session, just because it's exhausting anyway. And then being who I am and the type, I'd just rather everybody came for a short session and got what they had to get done, and then they go away and do something else and they come back later.
And I think that you can take care of what Mark's saying with the extrovert. Well, I don't know, I'm not extroverted, I don't really know, but presumably it would help if you knew up front, like, okay, this is going to be a 3-hour session.
Yeah.
So you know that it's 3 hours. It's not like we're cutting somebody off. I would assume, like, it's, they can prepare themselves for the fact it's 3 hours. I don't actually know if that works because, again, not being extroverted, I don't know if that would work for me, but.
I was thinking apropos of that as a negotiation tool. If you're opposite somebody in that place, then one tactic, and I'm not advocating this, but just to make the observation, one tactic might be to actually force things to keep going until eventually the other side breaks down and agrees. But, of course, the flip side is the other side breaks down and says there's no possibility to agree and I'm out of here.
I think you could go either way.
And I'm going to say, Yuki was being quite nice about nobody does that unless the parties agree. That's not really true in a commercial environment where often the lawyers decide that that's a really good thing and we're going to stay there as late as possible.
Oh, yes.
And we got a mediator just because they will stay there and bang heads until you wear out.
Yeah.
And it's perceived as actually like a really good mediation skill set that you can push people to the limit.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of, there's so many other things besides introversion that prevent parties from engaging fully after a certain period, so it's an issue. I really wanted to make sure we had a chance, though, to talk about 2 things that were kind of, I thought were interesting, just were intersections of introversion. Intersections of introversion and gender, and intersections with culture. And I just wanted to give the panelists like a couple minutes to talk about those 2 areas, and then we can kind of engage with other conversation if that works for everybody.
Sure.
You go for it.
I guess I had a couple of comments on the intersection of introversion and gender. One is that as a woman, I will often read as more extroverted than I really am, and that's because I speak quite quickly. There's a tendency for an introverted speech pattern to be slower because you're being more deliberative. But as a woman or as someone who is, in many different, whatever way, marginalized in society, it's often very hard to feel heard. And a lot of the time, you'll feel like, oh, if I stop speaking even for a second, someone else is going to interrupt me. I have this conversation with my father all the time because he's the sort of person who is in a position of power in a lot of his interactions and will be able to sort of sit back, take breaks, speak much more slowly and with pauses, and I then have a tendency to be the person who interrupts him. But
Between you and him.
but in his day-to-day interactions, that isn't as much of an issue for him, whereas I've been taught if I stop speaking, I'm not going to be able to get my point across. So that's a way in which I end up reading as much more extroverted than I really am. Another way that I find that gender and introversion can intersect is in I'll also read as shy and insecure, and I think that's partly because people sort of will look at a woman and think, oh, you know, I already read as more shy and insecure. So I had a recent moment at work. I'm working at a law firm this summer, where I was telling one of my supervisors, who is a man, that, you know, I was giving him some research and he was sort of pushing back and saying, okay, these are the things that, you know, I would argue on the other side, and I was thinking it through, but because I'm more introverted, I was sort of thinking it through by, you know, kind of doing my little frowning face and and nodding a little bit. And to him, I think it read as insecurity, because he suddenly went, but this isn't, you know, it's not a criticism of you, and kind of seemed to be stressing that I was feeling criticized or attacked, and I wasn't at all. So I think that that's another way in which sort of, because I read as someone who, you know, might be insecure or might feel criticized and attacked in this situation, and I'm in sort of this interesting power dynamic anyways in terms of the conversation that we're having, I read as insecure when really I'm just being introverted.
Interesting. May I ask you, did you say anything back to that? Like, did you...
All I said was, oh, no, I'm just thinking it through, and he was completely fine with that. And then we moved on, but it was,
I've had a number of senior men through my career apologize to me for things like that.
For
where
being
I'm like,
no,
it's fine. I'm just thinking about it.
Yeah.
Not so much Mark, but no. But I think, and I think that my experience as well with introversion is and gender, and I'm not sure which is which, and sometimes I feel a bit guilty about my introversion in certain circumstances because of this, but oftentimes I will wait to be asked for my opinion in meetings, and it's not necessarily because I'm female. It may be in part because I'm female. It's probably in some ways informed by it, but I will wait to be asked what I think. I won't necessarily come out with it for a variety of reasons. Maybe I've told somebody before the meeting, like maybe I've, you know, and I've assumed they'll state it, or I just am thinking about things so I don't feel the need to engage in that way until somebody asks specifically for what my thoughts are. But it's been interesting because early in your career, you don't get asked very often. So there's a lot of times where I would leave meetings and think like, oh, I had things to say there that, you know. So my trick has generally been, I often just tell Mark before, because people always ask Mark. So I tell Mark, and then he would know what I was thinking and why, and we would discuss it before the meeting in like a one-on-one interaction. And then it would get said in the meeting, but by somebody else, so it was heard. And I'm not, to this day, I'm not sure, is that because of the gender, or is that because of the introversion? I am automatically more comfortable having that one-on-one conversation with somebody and explaining what my thinking is and why my thinking is that way and where I think may need to go, or what I'm envisioning as being next steps and things like that, one-on-one. As I've gotten more senior, I find people more and more asking me my opinion when in meetings, and I think probably because you're constantly reminding Mark, he always asks me my opinion but you know, so as a result, I'm engaging more in that group dynamic over time. But I've definitely seen a difference, and I don't know whether it's learned and it's gender or if it's the introversion. kind of has elements of both.
I guess a test of that might be whether you behave in the same manner with people of different genders on the opposite side.
Yeah, I'd have to think about
power
that.
positions.
I mean, it's a hard it's a hard test in our profession because the likelihood of that happening is still lower than one might like. But yeah, it's I do notice that as well.
Did you want to join in on this
Yeah,
or shift it into culture?
Why don't we
even,
shift it into
or
culture? It's
combine?
related to. 'cause
Yeah, it
it's all,
is, for sure.
all related, but so Sharon had sort of talked about the cultural norms as sort of something that you wanted to touch on the panel, and so the thing that sort of struck me was like, okay, it's interesting, like what are cultural norms, and are they, you know, and is it the actual cultural norm, or is it like how people perceive you to be? So I'm female and I'm Asian and I'm Canadian, and so there's a certain sort of view of Asian Canadians, Asian Americans as kind of a model minority who don't talk much, but they work really hard, and you know they're good. And so, so they don't. So you know, my introversion kind of plays into that because I've always been seen as this smart Asian girl. So, and that just worked very well for many years, actually, until I think I actually hit the workplace and entrepreneurship and all these difficult things that didn't really fit into my preferences, and so so the challenge came out there. But so I sort of put that out there as like how sort of stereotypes can kind of play into this. And the other thing that I was going to say is like just to sort of really reflect on how much the valuing, and we talked about this earlier, about how we value these particular traits is really culturally based, right? And so, even in just these unconscious discussions, we have this sort of negative value that we seem to put on introversion, but to say in traditional Japanese culture, for women, introverted traits were probably quite favorably looked at, right? And I just wanted to sort of talk about this show that we've been watching at home. It's called Terrace House. It's a reality show, and it's on Netflix. And it's basically 3 young men and 3 young women are put into a house in a co-living situation, and see what happens. So right now they're in Hawaii, but they're all Japanese, either Japanese descent or Japanese speakers or whatever. And it's very interesting because you get a sort of a sense of what kinds of things are seen as perceived as a normal behavior or valuable behavior in terms of like genders, and then in terms of like how people relate to each other. And one of the things that has come up is there's a lot more emphasis now on expressiveness, and so people are expecting and valuing people who can talk about their feelings and talk about things that might have happened in the house between people, and be sort of quite direct and straightforward in a way that I never experienced Japanese culture myself, having I've been an immigrant and a child of immigrants and left many years ago. So I thought that was really interesting to sort of really show kind of like evolution and change in terms of what the cultural norm is. And also, and yet, you have the comments, because the show has like six or seven panelists who kind of watch all the episodes and then comment on this periodically through the whole thing. And they, sometimes they say things that sort of, for instance, are say, yes, it's a very strong woman, that kind of thing, like a so very gender-based comments as well. So there's still that sort of leftover gender norms that are still being worked through. So it's a very kind of interesting when you add on the culture, the gender, along with the type, and then you just have to make sure you're not paralyzed at the end.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. That's a good point. I don't know, when you're talking about the expressive, Yuki, I think one of the points that comes up when we talk about how one of the biases in mediation is a presumption that everybody will be expressive, right? So we automatically know but it's just not true. But it's a bias built into the process itself. Amanda, you want to say something? Step up, yeah.
I think that's kind of the one, like the expressive contained is the one space where I have a lot of trouble thinking of ways of setting the process up to support somebody who's on the contained side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Right? Because all of these things about the process, transparent, open, it seems very strategic, or, like you're not properly participating if you are behaving in a way that's contained. And so there's a lot of judgment there in how our process is designed. And so I'm kind of trying to think of, are there ways to invite somebody more fully into the process if they are contained?
And I'm going to say there definitely are. I don't know that we can go into a huge amount of it right now, but I did a panel with Julie Dom, Sarah Wells, and Shalina Nilani not that long ago. The focus was culture, and it was the way that culture can actually silence people in mediation. And we spent 2 hours, and a huge amount of it was actually around exactly that, is how do you create space for people who come from a more contained culture, for instance. There's other aspects to the cultural silencing that was going on, because we were talking microaggressions and things like that as well. But beyond that, a big focus was on how do you create space where it's not culturally appropriate to be expressive. And a lot of the different ideas that they were generating were things that related to support people, different types of ways of conveying information and evidence that didn't involve, it didn't involve sitting there and having to share in a large group. It might mean communicating through other types of sources. We also looked a little bit at the ways that some online tools can actually be quite comfortable for people who are not otherwise expressive. I actually have a close family connection right now who's going through a very difficult family matter, and she can't talk to me directly, and it's a cultural thing, and it's absolutely cultural, the inability to be expressive around what's happening within the family. But she can text me, and it seems to be a completely different experience for her to share in that form. And I've seen that in other cases. So anyway, I think there's a lot. It would be actually really interesting to have a more fulsome discussion about it. But I have lots of ideas I'm happy to share later. But I know we're kind of at the end of our time.
That simulated distances.
Yeah. Well, simulated distance, and the other one I'll throw out there purely because you said that, is the visceral connection with an avatar is grossly underutilized because people actually it's somewhere between being physically present and not. And a lot of the studies, it's mostly therapists and counselors who are looking at it, but some educators who are looking at how an online world where you actually participate by avatar creates this magic in-between space, and works really well in disability, but it also works really well in that space of I'm viscerally connected, I'm moving my body through this space, so I feel more like I'm there, but I'm at a disconnect. I don't actually see the person face to face.
And sometimes I think as well, at least for me, it can be as simple as somebody thanking me for my contribution because it's so difficult to make that movement into that space, that thank you for that contribution. My spouse is particularly good at this because he, oddly enough for an Englishman, is much more able to share things than I am, and he's always like positively reinforcing my ability to share my feelings. And I find that actually is like really good because I'm like, oh, okay. Like I'm like, it's like I also positively reinforce the dog, and I have no problem saying that like I am like the dog in this respect. Like I just need that positive reinforcement. I'm like, oh, oh, okay, I'm doing something good. Like this is you appreciate how difficult this was for me, you know. So I think that just
I think that might be a feeler thing.
Could be.
When people do that to me, I go, I'm fine. I am who I am. Get over it. Stop trying to.
A feeler thing.
I don't care that it's positive judgment. You're still judging me.
And like, back off, I don't need
Like,
that.
I don't
Stroke it,
care.
right? Give me a break. I'm in the same place as Rowan. I think that was definitely a feeler comment. And all I could think is how Rowan had to train herself, not in introversion, but in dealing with feeling with Darcy, so that she could keep saying, I support you.
No, thank you.
Anyway, we should wrap up for that. The online audience, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everybody here. I hope that we can get back together with everybody here, putting up their hand and saying how much they want to do a talk on September 27th and join us in our speed geeking. But do let me know. Think about it. But don't think too long, because we've only got 3 more slots left. Okay? All right, well, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And you too, Yuki.
It was very logical for you to be here.
We'll let the stream shut down and then.
Yeah, it's pretty sensitive. My guess.